Good morning everyone. I am happy to welcome you to the introductory session of this NPTEL course Indian Fiction in English. In today's session, I propose to give an outline of the course and also introduce a major text that we shall be discussing and also the frameworks within which this course has been structured, and also about how the course in general has been designed and conceived. As some of you might already be knowing, this is a 12-week course. It involves 30 hours of teaching. It's pitched at the postgraduate level. The pedagogy, the teaching method includes lectures and also certain presentations by students in which they shall be sharing their learning, their insights and whatever they had compiled through their own reading. And there will be prescribed readings for each week and sometimes for each session. And the only prerequisite for this course is that you must be familiar with the text discussed in each session throughout this course. This includes a familiarity with the novels prescribed for reading and also with the other critical material, which could include book length works as well as short essays or brief reviews of the works that we are discussing. And at the outset, we also will have a series of lectures which will give you a background, an overview, a sense of the historical origins and the historical background of the emergence of this genre, Indian fiction in English. And I also expect you to be familiar with the readings in that regard, so that you will be in sync with the things that we are discussing as a part of this course. Before I give an overview of the text that we shall be discussing as part of this course, I want you to pay attention to this term, Indian fiction in English. This descriptive term does have particular kinds of meanings and it does indicate certain kinds of texts. First of all, let me draw your attention to the language, English. As part of this course, we shall be focusing on Indian fiction written in English. By this I mean written originally in English, and we are not looking at the translations for this course. However, this does not mean that translations are not part of this oeuvre. Indian writing in English has expanded in multiple ways in the contemporary, so as to include translations and many other variants. But for this course, we shall be focusing only on the works originally produced and published in English. At the same time, we shall be engaging with certain debates which include many issues of translation, about the ideas of language and how language played a significant role during the wake of the colonial modernity. And when we look at the genre, which is fiction, we mostly include novels as part of this course. We also discuss just 2 short stories, but we of course shall be referring to some of the short stories when we are discussing the novels primarily. And the reason for including novels mostly is that Indian fiction in English has been primarily characterized by the output in terms of the novels. And the visibility of Indian fiction in English in the international literary market, it has also been mostly due to the kind of long fiction, the kind of novels which have been produced from this side of the world. And finally, coming to this term Indian, it's a very problematic category, and it continues to be a problematic category even while we are dealing with this course, Indian fiction in English. There are no fixed definitions which I can give by way of Indian, and mostly for this course we are going by the general understanding provided by the literary histories and the critical tradition. While we do not have a fixed kind of a definition for the term Indian, we also include a range of writers who are Indian and not Indian for some reason or the other. For example, we included Rushdie, who does not currently hold an Indian passport, and we also know the many controversies associated with his identity. We have Ruth Pravar Chhabwala, who was never an Indian as far as birth or ethnicity is concerned, but she's lived a considerable part of her youth in India because of her marriage to an Indian. And there is Raja Rao, who is Indian by birth, Indian by ethnicity, but at the same time during the most productive years of his literary output. He was not living in India, he was mostly living in abroad, and he continued to live and work in places outside India. So there are multiple ways in which the identity of Indian has been framed, and we try to include all of those variants and all of those ambiguities and ambivalences while we are dealing with the idea of Indian in this course, Indian Fiction in English. I've tried to conceive and frame this course in a particular way. It is not just about a series of novels which have been put together in a particular way. It is also about a certain way in which a certain framework has been generated to situate the text that we are discussing. And to aid me in this purpose, I have used certain texts which I refer to as a framing text for this course. They could also be considered as a secondary material, so some of the important secondary material as far as this course is concerned. And much of what is being dealt with in this course, and many of the arguments and many of the postulations, many of the critical frameworks have been drawn extensively from these works which are being referred to over here. And in addition, we shall also be referring to a certain other text which will be discussed with you in due course. We look at Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's Illustrated History of Indian Literature in English, which was published in 2003. This is by far the latest literary history as far as the history of Indian writing in English is concerned. It also has extensive sections talking about Indian fiction in English. Here I also want to remind you that though this course is titled Indian Fiction in English, it's a history that it shares with the larger overall Indian writing in English. And in turn, much of the current writings, whether it's literary history or critical writings, much of the current writings on Indian writing in English is also mostly and vastly about Indian fiction. So there's a way in which this genre has begun to dominate not just the literary market, the academic frameworks, the publishing scenario, the target audience, etc. So it's in these contexts that we shall be approaching this course, Indian Fiction in English. And we shall be looking at Meenakshi Mukherjee's Realism and Reality, the Novel and Society in India, published in 1985. This incidentally is a text which could be considered as a pioneering work as far as study of fiction, academic study of fiction in India is concerned. This work, Realism and Reality by Meenakshi Mukherjee, it gives insightful understanding of the origin of novel in India, and also gives a wider understanding of how important it is to look at this genre of fiction when we talk about the literary and cultural background, the literary and cultural output of the contemporary. Premada Gopal's The Indian English Novel Nation, History and Narration, published in 2009. It is a very useful work in helping us understand the connection between novel and the nation, especially in the context of Indian fiction written in English. And finally, of course, Srinivasa Iyengar's seminal work, Indian Writing in English, published in 1965, that continues to be a foundational text for the understanding of this course. We time and again go back to Iyengar to get a historical sense of this genre, to get an understanding of the initial ways in which the genre was talked about, how it was critically framed, how it was historically positioned. You would begin to realize that we also move away from Iyengar's postulations. While Iyengar's work continues to be a foundational work, it's also important to bring in new kinds of critiques and important to move away from Iyengar so as to see the newer avenues, so as to engage with the newer kinds of texts which are being brought to us. So this is not to say that this entire course is based on these 4 texts, but these 4 texts in certain ways frame the overall idea of the course. But of course, as I mentioned, we shall be looking at certain other works which shall be discussed with you in due course. And as far as the primary texts are concerned, we are looking at novels and short stories, the details of which will be discussed with you shortly. There are 3 major phases that we are looking at as far as this course is concerned, and this would overall remain the structure, the main structure of this entire course as well. We begin by looking at the historical background, the origins, and also the early novels which were published, and some of them are not fit enough to be called as novels, so they are merely referred to as proto-novels or early narratives. And what makes the discussion significant in this first phase is the impact of colonial modernity. And in the first few sessions, we shall be extensively looking at the idea of colonial modernity and how it impacted the emergence of this new genre in the nation which was yet to be formed. And this phase also primarily is a discussion of the 19th century. So, in that sense, it also has a it also lays a chronological foundation to the course. And from this phase, the 19th century phase of colonial modernity, 19th century and early 20th century, from this phase we move on to the novels of the 1930s and 1950s, and this is certainly a very important segment in this in our discussion. This is also, these two decades, they also frame a major part of our discussion as far as this course is concerned. And also, when we are talking about the major periods in the history of Indian fiction in English, this is undoubtedly one of the beginnings which has been located by many of the historians and critics. So, the novels of the 1930s, 40s and 50s, they are also characterized by a very fervent Gandhian nationalism, and also the ideas and ideals related to independence. We find that in the 1930s and 40s, we have the pre-independence period, and also in the late 40s and early 50s, there is the anxiety and the hopes and the newer kinds of articulations of post-independent India. And in this phase, which is spread across the pre-independence and the post-independence period, we find the coming together of a nation. We find that the novel as a genre is aiding the process of nation building, is aiding the process of a group of people becoming one in the name of a nation. And there are many other things that we shall be discussing as part of this, particularly the influence of Gandhi and many ways in which nation begins to come together in the name of a single cause, which is anti-colonial as well as pro-nationalist. And there is a brief phase of lull in the 1960s and 70s, which we would notice. There are also multiple ways of looking at it, which we shall be doing in the coming sessions. We find that there are women writers who are emerging. There are also different kinds of Indian writings which are beginning to emerge. That's also the phase when the nation as a whole is undergoing a certain kind of fragmentation, a kind of disillusionment with the promises of modernity and with the promises of independence which was given to the nation in the 1940s and 1950s. And it is in this context that we approach the post-1980s, which is primarily the post-Rushdie decade. And this decade, rather the decades after the 1980s, it has been described in multiple ways. Rushdie-esque, after Rushdie of course, post-colonial, given the particular kind of positioning that the nation has in the contemporary. And this phase is also described as the contemporary phase of Indian writing in English. And incidentally, we also find more international recognition, visibility and attention being given to this body of writing known as Indian fiction in English. And we also in that context discuss the many politics and the different kinds of discussions related to the publishing scene, the literary market, the politics behind the awards, etc. Now, let me walk you through the set of novels that we shall be discussing as part of this course. Some of them are meant for detailed study, and some of them will only be introduced to you by way of the presentations made by students. This list may look fairly long to you, but however, it's a good idea to be at least partially familiar with most of the works that we discuss as part of this course. This will give you a general understanding of this entire oeuvre and also enable you to engage with more similar works from different parts of the world. We begin by looking at Rajmohan's Wife, which is the first novel written in English, and which is the first novel written in English in India. This was published in a serialized form in 1864, and the entire book came out. It came out in the form of a book only in 1935. This was by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who also interestingly shifted entirely to writing in Bengali after this first work, Rajmohan's Wife, which has also been considered as a false start by him. And we do not devote much time to a close reading of Rajmohan's Wife. We introduce the work to you and also try to situate it in the contemporary, particularly with reference to one of the important essays by Meenakshi Mukherjee, which tries to situate the contemporary relevance of Rajmohan's Wife in the larger history of Indian fiction in English. We look at Untouchable by Mulk Raj Anand, the novel published in 1935 and one of his most successful and well acclaimed novels. And as part of this course, we shall be looking at Untouchable and The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy in almost in tandem, because both engage with the idea of caste. So, we in the structure of the course, we shall not necessarily be going in this chronological fashion as this list shows. We talk about Kantapura by Rajarao in 1938. That is a novel which has been positioned as the most important early novel in the history of Indian writing in English. It is also one of the first earlier novels to successfully talk about Gandhian nationalism and to situate its relevance in the literary oeuvre. We discuss Waiting for the Mahatma by R.K. Narayan. It's a novel published in 1955, again one of his very successful works. Here we also find a different kind of nationalism at work, a different kind of Gandhi being projected vis-a-vis Kantapura. And let me also remind you that as and when we are going through these discussions as part of this course, I want you to not look at these works in isolation, but to be able to see the connections, the relations which are being highlighted between these works. Because the beauty of this course, the beauty of the discussion lies in being able to see the connections, the interconnections, the intertextuality, and also how eventually we begin to find a subtle pattern emerging out of these discussions. So, coming back to the list of texts to be discussed, we have Cry the Peacock by Anita Desai, 1963. One of the foremost women writers in Indian writing in English. We talk about how Indian women novelists are positioned and how the 1960s and 70s have generally been seen as a period of lull in the larger history, but nevertheless we see a prolific output by a number of women novelists such as Anita Desai, and incidentally Anita Desai was also one of the earliest women writers in India who found international recognition and also got significant recognition within the home academies as well. Arun Joshi's The Strange Case of Billy Biswas, published in 1971, was a path-breaking work, and it is said that and it is often said that if the Rushdie moment had not come in the early 1980s, perhaps Arun Joshi would have received better kind of attention. And the other thing which shadows the presence and the visibility of Arun Joshi in the contemporary is the availability, or rather the unavailability of his works in international editions, because he always continued to publish with just Orient paperbacks. And that brings us to this very interesting novelist Ruth Pravar Chhabwala and her Booker-winning work Heat and Dust, which was published in 1975. And this is a very interesting fact to begin with, that Ruth Pravar Chhabwala, she enjoys much attention and visibility because she is the only writer to have received an Academy Award as well as a Booker Prize. And her work Heat and Dust, though it did not receive much of an attention in the literary academies within India, it continues to be seen as one of the most important works by Chhabwala. And Chhabwala also has a very interesting and a very contested kind of identity, because she was not born in India, she is not an Indian, and she came to India because she was married to an Indian man, and she also spent a considerable period of her youth living in this country, and that has also given a peculiar kind of flavor to her writing, because she writes in between this place which is between the insider and the outsider. She's not entirely an insider, but one cannot dismiss her as an outsider either. She writes about the uncomfortable positions that she had to take. She writes about the many challenges that she faced, but at the same time she's acutely familiar with the many flavors which only an insider would be familiar with. So this entire text could be this entire set of texts could be based upon the discussion in the first phase, where we look mostly at the early 19th century phase. Then we look at the pre-independence and the post-independence phase, and we also look at the development of the genre, the emergence of the genre in the years immediately after the event of independence. And this leads us to the most important phase, the post-1980s, which is characterized by Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which was published in 1981. And we also begin to realize that much of a discussion of the post-1980s is heavily overshadowed and heavily dictated by how Midnight's Children was received, how Midnight's Children was read, and how Midnight's Children continues to dictate the terms of publication and the terms of literary yardstick even in the contemporary. We look at the Shadow Lines by Amitav Ghosh, which is published in 1988, which is considered as one of the most brilliant narratives about the nation, looking at the ways in which the nation has been partitioned in from a literary perspective. Ghosh enjoys a very unique position in the history of Indian writing in English. His work Shadow Lines has been very well accepted, and it will not be an exaggeration to say that it is rather difficult to find negative reviews about this novel, The Shadow Lines. It also remains one of the all-time favorites of most of the readers of Indian fiction English. And then we look at the Trottonama by Alan Seeley, which was published in 1988. This is considered as one of the works which could be considered at par with Midnight's Children, but however, due to its less visibility and due to the unavailability of the text in the contemporary, this has not received the kind of academic attention that is due to it. And Ice Candy Man by Bapsi Sitwa is a partition novel. It talks about the violence and the many personal struggles which were inherent in this political event of the partition of India and Pakistan. Bapsi Sitwa also enjoys a unique kind of a position because of her identity. She is a Pakistani writer, but her work, particularly The Ice Candy Man, has been included as part of the larger oeuvre of Indian fiction in English. God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, published in 1996, is generally considered as the biggest Booker event after Midnight's Children by Rushdie. And post-1980s in that sense is extremely important in assuring and ensuring a very different kind of international recognition and opening up an international market for not just these Bookered events, but also for the many young writers who were trying their fortune in Indian fiction in English. And when we look at post-1980s and when we try and understand the ways in which this has opened up the market and opened up the readership of this genre in multiple ways, we see a prolific output as far as the publishing is concerned, but we limit our discussion to certain very visible names, and we also make this selection based on the critical attention which some of these writers and some of these works have received. We look at Riot, a novel by Shashi Tharoor, published in 2001, The Hungry Tide by Amitav Ghosh, published in 2004. This is also the second novel by Amitav Ghosh that we shall be looking at as part of this course. There is English August by Upmanyu Chatterjee, published in 1988. Though this is a 1980s work, the general understanding and the discussions as part of English August is more contemporary in nature, which is why this has been pushed to the contemporary phase. The White Tiger by Arvind Adiga, published in 2008, is yet another Booker event, and also Kiran Desai's Inheritance of Laws, published in 2006. Both Booker events in rather adjacent years. That was also an important phase in the history of Indian fiction in English, and also for accentuating the kind of position that this genre had, not just in the national scenario but also in the international scenario. And we end our discussion by looking at this different kind of work, Zilaldin as a Mask by Alan Seeley. This was published in 2017. Though this is partly written in verse, as the subtitle implies, a mask, this has been categorized as fiction. And it also enables us to talk about the many interesting experiments that Indian writing in English has been engaging with, particularly in the contemporary, and how the international market and the national academies have opened themselves up to receiving these newer kinds of experiments coming from the writers of Indian fiction in English. We also look at two short stories, Laburnum for My Head by Temsula Au, one of the northeastern writers. It's a short story collection published in 2009. We look at a couple of short stories from this collection. We also look at a very interesting short story by Geeta Hariharan published in 2004. Its title Remains of the Feast. Due to time constraints, we may not be able to deal in detail with all of these works, which is rather obvious as well. However, we try and bring in discussions and also introduce you to the different critical traditions which have projected these particular works. And while as part of this course we may not be able to offer detailed summaries, we introduce you to different ways of looking at the text, reading the text, and also seeing connections between them and placing them in the larger context of literary studies. And for this, as stated in the beginning, stated at the outset of this course, the only prerequisite is that you should already be familiar with the readings which are prescribed as part of this course, including the novels, short stories, and the critical writings. Having introduced the set of works that we shall be discussing as part of this course, I want you to be alert to the fact that we shall be looking at the connections, the interconnections across these works in multiple ways. One of the things that seem to be tying at least some of the works together is that they were all Bookered events. In fact, the very possibility of highlighting this as a separate genre, Indian fiction and English, and also the possibility of offering this as a separate course, as an entire course itself, rests largely, if not entirely, in the many Bookered events which ensured visibility and critical attention to this genre. In the late 1970s, when the genre was almost declared dead by a number of critics, what helped the resurrection of this genre was a major Booker event, Salman Rushdie's novel. So the Bookered events, the discussion of these Bookered events also become a major part of this course as well. As part of this course and the critical tradition that it accesses, you may begin to notice that the discussions about the Bookered events start mostly with Salman Rushdie. And Salman Rushdie's work, in fact, it received the Booker Prize, it won the Booker of Bookers, it was again recently selected as the best of all the Bookered literary works. And this is notwithstanding the fact that there were two writers beforehand who received the Booker Prize. One is V.S. Naipaul and the other is Ruth Pravar Chabwala, whose work we shall be discussing as part of this course. And of course, we shall be discussing Arundhati Roy, Kiran Desai and Aravind Adiga. So at the outset, in this introductory session itself, I would like to clarify that we shall not be discussing V.S. Naipaul as part of this course on Indian fiction in English. While he has also written a fiction, we are not including Naipaul because of the peculiar kind of definition that we have adopted for the idea of Indian. Naipaul is an Indo-Caribbean writer who was born in Trinidad and he holds British citizenship, and by far he's got no lived experience in India. So while Chabwala, who is not an Indian in a certain way, has got lived experience and writes about it, we have not really selected Naipaul for the same reason. And this being clarified, I also introduce you to the multiple frameworks within which we will be discussing. The texts are prescribed. We shall be talking about the nation and its many stories, unlike an earlier generation of the pre-independence period when there was only one kind of story of the nation which was being highlighted. In the post-1980s, we have many different kinds of stories being told by different kind of people. And we also talk about the implications of secularism and the secular self, particularly in the creation of Indian fiction in English, and how in general the plot structure is also benefited or is also much informed by the understanding of secularism and the secular self. We talk about how certain major national events such as partition and emergency, they find their way into the narratives as far as this genre is concerned. We talk about certain post-Ayodhya events and communal riots which also occupy a central space, particularly in the post-1980s fiction. We talk about the different kinds of othering based on religion, gender, region and language. We try to bring in the critical understanding from different disciplines and from different perspectives and viewpoints to enable our reading of a particular novel. We also finally talk about caste, which is difficult to find at the outset as far as this genre is concerned. So, we will be talking about its minimal presence and also the many absences as far as our caste is concerned. There are certain texts which would lend itself to the discussion of caste in an easier way, but we also talk about what precisely is the challenge when we begin to talk about caste in a space, in an international space such as Indian fiction in English. Having given a detailed outline of how the course has been structured and conceived, I would like to leave you with these thoughts. These are some of the expected outcomes of this course. At the end of this course, I expect you to be familiar with the domain and at least a few representative texts. Of course, we shall not be able to familiarize ourselves with all kinds of works produced as part of this genre, but the familiarity with this domain will, hopefully help you to make an informed decision and selection so as to choose your further readings. And this course, at the end of it, will enable the learners to explore more not just in terms of the novels and short stories, but also in terms of the many critical traditions which will enable your understanding of one particular literary domain. It will also help you to see the connections and the intertextual references across texts and also across periods. And finally, last but not the least, one of the foremost things that I look forward to imparting as part of this course are the skills for critical inquiry and academic research. So, this course in that sense is not presented as an isolated discussion of a series of texts which bear the label Indian fiction in English, but it has been presented and the entire discussions are staged in such a way that they will open up avenues to interact with other disciplines, other frameworks and other perspectives. And hopefully this course will also give you a taste for exploring and for reading more of such similar texts. That's all we have for today by way of introduction. Thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.